Hello, and welcome once again to a special bonus episode of the Spouter-Inn. I'm Chris.
And I'm Suzanne. And this time we're excited to have a special guest joining us. Nahir Otaño Gracia is an assistant professor of English at the University of New Mexico. Thanks to a Mellon Fellowship, she's currently a member at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, New Jersey. Her theoretical frameworks include translation theory and practice, the global North Atlantic, Britain, Iberia, and Scandinavia, and critical identity studies. Her current projects include a monograph entitled The Other Faces of Arthur, Medieval Arthurian Texts from the Global North Atlantic, and a co-edited volume entitled Women's Lives, Self-Representation, Reception, and Appropriation in the Middle Ages, which will be coming out early next year. Welcome, Nahir. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
I am so excited to get to talk some more about Laxdæla Saga. When did you first read this book? How did you come across this? Was this your first saga?
Well, I came across it as an undergraduate student at the University of Puerto Rico. A new hire in the comparative literature department, Elizabeth Polhill, she gave a course. It was a master's course on the Sagas. And even though I was an undergraduate, I decided that I really wanted to take it. I had taken with her, I think, like the introduction to medieval literature, and I really enjoyed it. And so I wanted to keep doing it. And I just fell in love with the Sagas. I really loved them. And it was really lucky because from there I went to UMass Amherst. And they had they still have a wonderful, thriving Germanic studies department, and they were teaching Old Norse and Old Norse Icelandic, the language there. And so I was able to take Old Norse Icelandic, and I was able to take classes with Professor Cheryl Harbinson again on the Saga. So it was kind of like it just happened, and there's no looking back after that.
And you've gotten to know them over years and years, so you must...
Yeah.
I find that books I read over a long period of time, like they feel different and they mean different things and say different things. And I wonder if that's part of your experience as well.
Yes. I've been really lucky that I got to read them in Spanish and then in English and then in Old Norse Icelandic. And they mean different things, different times. But I think what is interesting is that the more I read them, the more I connect to them as a woman I'm from Puerto Rico, and I see myself as a Caribbean woman. And the more I connect to them as a Caribbeanist than I do as a medievalist, which I find sort of shocking. But the more I think about it, the more I realize that they are more and more becoming that to me. I connect with them because of the sea. And for example, one of the first things I remember about that course that I took was the professor, she had us read Borges. So he has a book on Literaturas Germánicas. And it's a little book, but I remember that the book talks about the Vikings as the pirates. And I know that there's often this idea you can't talk about Vikings as pirates, and there's like all these complicated ideas about pirates and Vikings. But for me, pirates were the reason why Puerto Ricans survived and thrived under like a harsh colonial, Spanish rule, because without pirates, people would have starved. People on the coast would have starved. And so pirates were an important economic movement. They were necessary. And I understand Vikings also the same way. Vikings were in many ways necessary for the movement of the economy. They did so many important things because of their movement and travel. And so the more I understand them through that Caribbean lens, I feel like it gives me a different access to them.
That's so fascinating, talking about the way in which the seascape functions and the economic exchange that takes place on the seas. When Chris and I were doing the regular episode, we talked a little bit about Viking as an activity or a vocation, and how goods go out and come back, and that's sort of like the economic substrate. And it's fascinating to hear you talk about that.
Yeah, it makes sense to me that it was necessary, even though as it is vilified, right? And who gets to talk about it, right? So it's always as it is always shocking to me to hear people talking about pirates in a way that's not, when it's not romanticized. Like when I read the literature about them, it's very shocking to me because that's not how I understand pirates. And I think then I see the Vikings in that way as well.
That's really interesting. It's also interesting that this particular saga, while it does talk a bit about economics and why people travel and what happens when you encounter other people, it's not, as I think I mentioned in the main conversation, it doesn't really talk about that piracy angle so much.
No. And that's also the thing. Pirates in Puerto Rico weren't pirates. They were just Puerto Ricans who lived at sea and needed to do this work to help the people survive. They were our Robin Hoods, right? So again, that's why to me it's also reading these stories was really, in some ways, really wonderful, is because I could see this. This is just people living their lives. And so yeah, and that's another way that I connect with them is I see them, even like this idea of them being sort of matter of fact, and
Right.
and the way that they combine both like sort of Christian religion, but also pre-Christian religions. I actually connect them again with magical realism. There's a sense in which when I first read these sagas, the thing that to me that I would often think about was Cien Años de Soledad, which is also a family saga. Which
That's
gives
true.
it is absolutely a family saga.
And they all have the same names in that one as well.
Yeah. So I remember reading this, and I think, again, it's an idea also in retrospect, as I see my memories of these texts, how much they come through this different lens, because more and more I think of magical realism, and I think of 100 Years of Solitude, and the idea of these family sagas that teach you something, and that there is something behind that combination of matter of fact and really difficult emotions that is also about telling a different story that you can't just say. So that's, for me, is part of what magical realism is doing, realismo mágico, and how it functions in the Caribbean. I always wonder what is being hidden by that combination because of that.
I wonder sometimes if part of what's going on there is the sense of a kind of a knowledge that accumulates over time and accumulates within the families, that doesn't need to be spoken explicitly because it's held collectively in some way. And we were talking a little bit, Chris and I, about kinship relations, but that didn't seem like very good language to express what was going on there over the generations.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it's hard to know, but I do feel like there's something hidden between in these stories, in the silences that it's hard to reach at, but I always wonder about it. What is it trying to say? And I think that Laxdæla, this saga in particular, there's so much that is just not said.
Can you give some examples of that? I mean, I have some ideas, but you know the text so much better.
Well, I always wonder about the ending, which is my favorite ending.
Isn't it
right?
amazing? I love that. I love that.
So, the son asks, who do you love the most? Who was your favorite husband? You have 4 husbands, right? And her answer, I think, something like, the one I love the most is the one I treated the worst, or I
and it's so enigmatic. Yeah.
Yeah. And then he says, I know now who it, like, you don't have to say the name like that, but that doesn't tell me anything. It tells them something, right? What is it left unsaid? And I've every time I read it, I actually change my mind about who she's talking about.
It's almost like a riddle.
Yeah.
Really? Now, that's interesting, because I've always read that the same way, but yeah, I may be boring. I agree. I mean, there's totally more than one possibility for who she could be talking about, but I've always assumed she's talking about Kjartan there.
Yes. Because that's the thing. He asks whose husband. Like, which of your 4 husbands?
And she really doesn't want to answer that question, which makes me think that it's because it's none of the husbands.
Because it's none of the husbands. But that's not the question either.
That's true.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. That's the thing. And also, who did she treat worse, Kjartan or Botley?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It's both pretty bad. It's a race to the bottom.
And it's not like, I've always felt such a kinship with her.
I really want to hear you talk about that, because I found myself being kind of fascinated by and outraged by her both at the same time.
So it's interesting because I feel like in this particular saga, women seem to have more options, and yet they're so trapped. I mean, I think she's so trapped. Like how a woman with 4 husbands who manages to divorce the first, seems, how can she still seem so trapped to me? And this, I think this saga in particular is one that seems to give women so many options, and yet it seems to not be giving them any options. When you get other sagas, maybe like Egil saga, in which women almost seem to be treated like property, and yet they thrive, and when you meet like Egil's daughters in other, I think it's in Njal saga, where she chooses her husband, then it makes you think differently about Egil saga. At least it made me think differently about Egil saga. So what is it about this saga that's so much about women and it's so woman-centered, and yet I feel that it's also about not having choices.
And not just for Gudrun, too. There's so many women, minor characters or smaller characters who are constrained in their choices in these terrible ways. One of the episodes that struck me a lot was when Thurid takes revenge on her ex-husband, Geirmund, and she goes to the ship and she takes his sword and she leaves behind their baby daughter. It's a terrible thing she does, right? But it's also like, what are her options? What are the possibilities open to her? And then with Melkorka, it's even more extreme. What are her options?
And what is the role of children in these interconnections? I always think about that. It's like your children in some ways is what tie you to people, right? I think as a woman, it ties you so much to somebody else, to your partner, right? So when you want to cut off complete relations, I think children to me, symbolizes that, like, complete rupture with somebody is to give them their child back. So I always saw that as that, but how extreme is it that that's the only way that you can attain some sort of autonomy again, right? That's the option to you, is cut yourself off from your own children.
It's terrible.
And that's the terrible options. These are not options at all then.
The other thing along those lines that I always think about is Un at the very beginning of the story, who is the woman who brings this family tree to Iceland, right? She's the one who finally makes a decision, let's go to Iceland, and settles down there. And it's her descendants that we're following. She's the only woman who gets to leave the island. Like, she had that decision to be able to go there, but it seems that once they're in Iceland, nobody else really gets to travel. No other women get to travel. Traveling is strictly a male thing, it seems, in this saga.
I guess that's true, because there's also that moment when Olaf goes to Ireland when he meets his grandfather, and Melkorka has asked him to bring back her old nurse, and the king says, no, you can't take her back. So, I mean, it's even made explicit.
And I think Gudrun asks to go along with Kjartan.
And he's like, no possible way.
And she's like, nope. He's like, nope, that's not going to happen. And I was like, okay, is there a reason why that's not happening? Like, she seems like she'd be pretty good at this.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that she could have traveled with him if they were married. I'm honestly, I need to check that, but I'm pretty sure that marriage would have made it okay for her to travel. So I've always kind of seen that also as rejecting her at that moment.
Yeah.
Basically saying, I'm not marrying you now. I'll marry. Like, I mean, that's what he did. He left. He did what the young man did. He left to Norway, and then he got together with the king's sister. So.
Yeah, but he's also like showing his control over her, right?
Yeah. He's
saying, I will marry you. Like, it seems clear that that's his eventual intention.
Yeah.
But it's going to be on my terms.
Yeah, good luck with that, Kjartan.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so it's a bit of putting Gudrun in her place before being willing to accept her as a wife.
Yeah.
And yeah, the dynamics of all of that are I mean, they're terrible, but they're fascinating.
Yeah. And I remember when I think the second time I read this saga as a scholar, which was as a grad student with Cheryl Harbinson, she was telling us that there's speculation that a woman wrote this saga because women are so central to this story, and there's no way for us to know, but
it's striking.
It is striking. And I think what's most striking is that how complicated these women are, how all these ideas about navigating all of sort of ideas about control and who gets to speak are very much, I think, presenting real ways in which women are constrained, but also find power, and how complicated it is. So it always seemed to me like a real possibility that a woman was involved in the saga, in the getting it written down or codified in some way, or that it was a story, that it was primarily by woman for woman or something like that.
I was so struck by the way in which in the very last parts of the saga, I mean, almost all we're hearing about is women, other than the questioner of Gudrun. We hear about Gudrun when she's become devout, and she's, she's the first Icelandic woman to learn the Psalter, and she spends a long time in prayer. Her granddaughter Herdis, who's with her, and then that buried woman, that prophetess from long ago. That's that kind of invasive presence. That passage I was so fascinated by. Her body's gotten rid of from beneath the church floor, but it's not burned and thrown away. It's reburied elsewhere in a different location that's maybe more peripheral. And so, you think about women's power, there's so many different configurations of it just in that one little scene.
Absolutely. And how do you get that power, right? Like, what did she have to do to be at that moment where she's being able to tell people move the body, right? And I think it's this same saga where there's also the sort of the ghost of the man that he's at the door, right? And you have to also, right? So when you also put those in contrast of how that male ghost sort of acts and reacts to things and what they do to him versus how the woman react, right? I always found that striking, that somehow there's a sort of less violence in the way that this body is treated versus the body of the first ghost.
Oh, I wonder, one of the things that also really struck me about this saga, and I haven't read enough of them to have a sense of whether this is very typical or unusual, is the way that textiles show up over and over again. And it's sometimes in connection with wonderful clothing that people have. So, for example, Olaf starts being called Olaf Peacock because he comes back from Norway with these really beautiful clothes. So we also see Melkorka's clothing when she's just been purchased from the slave market. She gets the beautiful clothing in place. But then there's also that headdress that's given by the king's sister to Kjartan. She reaches into a casket and she takes a white headdress embroidered with golden threads. She gives it to Kjartan and she says that she hoped that Gudrun, Osvif's daughter, would enjoy winding this about her head. And of course, that headdress becomes this bone of contention that sort of inflames this conflict within the family. And then there's that scene when Botli gets killed. Gudrun is wearing this shawl that the blade gets wiped on. So there's like so many. I was just struck by that. I don't know if that's just absolutely typical and that's just a thing that happens all the time in the sagas, or if fabrics are in some way kind of, I don't know, part of that world of economic exchange that we see in the sagas. But also, things. I don't know. I mean, I don't want to generalize, but like things women notice, things women think about that, it's part of literally the fabric of everyday life.
It's all of it, right? Clothing and textiles are a big deal, I think, in other sagas. So in Gisli's saga, the women are actually creating cloth in sort of when they're sort of talking together. And basically the husband hears his wife say that she kind of liked Gisli's wife's brother, I think it is. Right. And so at the moment, they were basically inside the house creating textile, right, making the cloth. And so it's supposed to be a private space for them to be able to talk. And he kind of invades it in some ways. And when he is actually leaving and sort of in exile, she gives him cloth because he can actually exchange that for help and goods. So cloth is actually really important in other parts of the saga. And the women are the ones that create it, right? So when, for example, when Gudrun creates the shirt that's really low, she probably created the cloth itself and then made the shirt. Right. So yes, absolutely. It is something that is economic. It is something that you can use. And then it has all these other meanings. There's also the scene where Kjartan is given a cloak by the king.
Yeah.
Right. After the swimming contest. And they ask him, the text actually says they were about the same size, right? It's literally measuring them up. And that they measure the same, right? So here you have a saga that is actually very concerned with ideas about sovereignty. And you have a character that we're told has a kingly lineage, right, through his mother. And he's measured to be of the same size as the king through this cape, right? So clothes constantly does that. Then you have the headdress, and a gift, a kingly gift that then actually brings trouble to Iceland. And I feel like there's a lot of that, like sort of these kingly gifts that bring trouble to Iceland. You can see that in other sagas as well, and the textiles itself and the headdress, right? That I think the sister, she says something like, "Here, have these headdress so that Gudrun knows that you weren't hanging out with like descendants of slaves," right?
Yeah,
which is like
right.
It's such a great line. It's like, you're the sister of the king. You're far the field from descendants of slave. But also, that's Kjartan's mom too. She was a slave. So I feel like there's sort of this underspeaking in this saga that's so fascinating that I read it new like every time that I think about it, because it's just, what does it mean to say something so ironic when you're the sister of the king?
I'm fascinated by what you were saying about sovereignty, because I was really struck by that too, by the ways in which there was this kind of fierce independence with regard to Iceland. Like you see it play out in the whole question of whether they're going to convert to Christianity or not, and kind of complicated relationship to Norway in general, right? But also the ways in which there's not a sort of highly centralized authority in Iceland either. Like there's like, it's not a vacuum exactly, but there's not a clear sense of where sovereignty lies at any one time. And I was really curious about that, if that was something that was particular to the Laxdæla saga, or again, if that's part of the world of the sagas.
Yeah, I think it's part of the world of the saga, but definitely the Laxdæla saga really plays a lot into it, right? Like the relationship between Iceland and Norway. And, these sagas are about sort of earlier time in the history of Iceland, but they were written down when Iceland is part of Norway. And I think it's always important to remind ourselves that Iceland was a colony, first of Norway and then of Denmark, until the 20th century.
Yeah.
So they're writing these stories when they are basically under the leadership of Norway. I often think both Christianity and having to be under basically colonial rule, they voted on it and they said yes, but I always feel it's like, they had no option but to say yes. It wasn't that, and this is how I often see it. And again, this is coming from being a Caribbean woman from Puerto Rico, where I am myself, part a colonial subject of the United States now, but also a colonial subject of Spain. It's not like you necessarily get a choice in these things, right? So I always see that. And so when I read these sagas and I read the ways that the texts create these connections with the kings, and in which the Icelandic Vikings, the Icelandic sagas show these men being equal to the king, wearing the cloak and measuring the same, is also talking about that anxiety of the position of Iceland in the present in which they're written, but and the fact that they're sort of remembering this magnificent past when they were free men.
Yeah, that's one of the things I also find really fascinating about this one, and I guess the other ones as well, is that Iceland has this myth in the sense of big idea, not myth in the sense of false thing. This myth about this time when they were more or less independent, and that they chose not to have a king. They chose to find some other political structure to organize themselves. And it was one that, there were more powerful people and less powerful people, but it was one that involved a lot of talking and processing and group gathering and deciding upon things. I don't want to paint too rosy a picture of it, but it seems a lot more process-oriented in a way that might be very appealing to us these days than kingship, than that sort of top-down structure. And I like how, as you say, this is remembering a time when there were no kings, or there were kings and they were outside, but we chose not to be part of that system. And also that it's working through, what does it mean? Like, how do you govern without governing? Or how do you use soft power to try to, keep the lid on the boiling pot of anger that happens when people have to live together on a small island? I love that this text is thinking through that.
So I think part of it, for what I see here, is also lamenting that it didn't work. That, when we look at the saga, Neil Saga and Laxdæla Saga, the idea that the great men of Iceland died because we have this system that calls for revenge. They lost so many men through this. So I see it also as a mourning of the men that died because of these revenge systems that took away Kjartan and Botley, both so promising. And that loss of that man is also, to me, again, is also the loss of their government, of that independence in some ways. So I actually find it interesting, because I think one of the things that a lot of people find exciting about the sagas is, again, it's like the matter-of-fact way, and how they seem to sort of, that the emotions seem to be sort of hidden or curtailed, but I find them to be deeply emotional in other ways. I find there's a sense of loss when I read these stories that is so forbidden, I guess, is so strong in how all these things are happening. And like I said, I read them this way because I am coming, I think, from a Caribbean background, and so I read them differently, right? My academic work is I do work on Old Norse Icelandic, but I look at the writer sagas, which are about King Arthur, and those sort of are a little later, and they do something different. But for me, I think part of the reasons why I don't work on these sagas is because for me they're so, I connect to them so deeply and emotionally in these ways that I don't think that I could do the research that it would require. I probably would get angry at everybody. It's like, no, that's not what they're doing. They're talking to Borges. They're not.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm totally on board with that reading. I agree. One of the things I like about that flatness of affect that it provides is that once you get to know these stories better, I mean, maybe it took me a little while. Maybe it was faster for you to read it this way, but they are absolutely devastating. There is so much emotion going on just under the surface. I completely agree with that reading of it.
But they're very quiet at the same time.
Yeah. Again, it reminds me of my grandmother. When I remember reading these, it's like, oh, my grandmother would totally fit in here. She was such a powerful and quiet presence. Like, when my grandmother was a very quiet woman, and yet she controlled the room and the space, and in some ways, she owned all of us. And I see, when I read these sagas again, I connect to them in these really personal ways, and so it makes them very hard to sort of see them in these, when I think about my academic work, it's very hard to see them that way. I always sort of respond to them emotionally, which is, I find, kind of amazing, because it always strikes people they don't expect it. But I think that in some ways, what that says to me is that these sagas belong in a long history of literature, of preservation, and of sort of communities finding ways to persist despite colonization, and despite having people come in and tell you how you're supposed to live your life, right? Why is it then that we create these sagas about families that find ways to resist that subordination? So for me, I see them as part of a very long history of this, that is not that they're the same, is that they are tools that we can use to resist subordination. And these kind of texts that create these stories of families that are told in these ways, where there's these big pockets of silences that they're telling so much that you can't really see it. This is also a tool, an important tool. So I see them in that as part of that sort of very long tradition.
You mentioned that you work on the Arthurian sagas, which I've heard about, but I don't know anything about. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what they're like and how they compare to some of these family sagas.
They are different from the family sagas, right? These are, most of them are translations. There's, for example, a translation of the Anglo-Norman French saga into Old Norse Icelandic, which was originally Norwegian, but we only have it available in Icelandic text. And then the Icelanders did a sort of translation of that translation that doesn't really follow it. So I call it a pseudo-translation. It's pretending to be a translation, but it's doing so many different things. So we have those two. Those are sort of two big ones, 13th and 14th century. Then there's translations of some of the Chrétien de Troyes romances into Old Norse Icelandic and more things, but those are sort of the really big ones that I work with.
Often when people talk about the Vidara Saga, they understand them as just sort of a secondary outgrowth from the main wellspring of romance in medieval French literature. But you come at it in a very different kind of way where it's not about center and periphery. It's a very different kind of approach. Can you talk more about that? Because I know that your work on the global North Atlantic is really interested in not looking at Old Norse and Icelandic literature, not sort of as a national literature, but rather as a literature of a region that has all kinds of interconnectivity down in medieval Spain and places like that.
Yes. So I look at Arthurian literature as a system. There's just so much of it, especially in Europe and in the Middle Ages. And so I see them as part of that. And when I look at the global North Atlantic, I see them as part of sort of this sort of bigger system of literature that is trying to say something as a collective in some ways. And so I see them sort of working in that way. I also try to very hard to see what they do locally and what they do globally as part of that system of translations. And what I find, I think that locally, part of what they're doing, since the versions that we have are Icelandic, I think that they are also about validating movement and travel and those that are not kings, right? Because the versions that are translating, the translations that we have, most of them are about the knights of the Round Table. They're not about King Arthur per se. So I think that they fit in the ways that they fit in the sort of larger Old Norse Icelandic system is that sort of idea of movement and travel as part of the story that you tell. I think in a more global system, I think Arthurian stories, it's sort of a way for Europe to test the language of chivalry, which is a language for me of sort of expansion and expanding the borders of Europe. So I see these texts first when Norway started to translate them, and then later on when the Icelanders started to translate as ways to negotiate their position both within Europe and the peripheries of Europe. So that's how I come at them.
It's so interesting. One of the other things I was really struck by when you were talking a little bit earlier about your emotional and kind of affective response to the Icelandic family sagas was that you'd read the Laxdæla saga, or read sagas, I guess generally too, in multiple different languages, that you'd come at them first as an undergraduate in Spanish translation, then later in modern English translation, and then reading them in Old Norse and Old Icelandic. And I thought, God, it feels so different. It looks so different depending on what language you're experiencing a text in. And Chris and I often will talk about translation and inhabiting different linguistic systems. I'd love to hear you talk more about those experiences.
It really changes the text. And I think it enriches the text because...
Yeah, you know it from all these different angles, kind of.
Yeah, because then they show you different interpretations, right? So I see translations as a way... Translations, just tell you as much about the text that got translated as they do as the culture and the person that translated that text, right? Because when we're making translations, we're making choices about why we translate something the way we do. So for an example about how I translate is, right now I'm translating a Catalan text into English and Spanish, La Faula. And so when I was doing the translation into Spanish, there's a scene where there's a parrot, papagayo. Mm-hmm. And I could have left it as papagayo in Spanish, but in Puerto Rico, we don't call papagayos or parrots, we don't call them papagayos, we call them cotorras. Mm-hmm. And so we chose to translate it as cotorra because we decided that the translation that we're doing is me, a Puerto Rican woman, and my colleague Antonia, who's from Ecuador. We decided that we were going to prioritize a Latinx translation of the text. And so we chose to translate it as cotorra instead of papagayo. And so I think that translations do that. So at first, when I read it in Spanish, I didn't know this, right? You just imagine yourself, you just translate reading the text. But as I keep reading these new versions, they give me different perspectives. How do other people read these sagas, right? And what does it tell us about how people understand them? So I think there was some of that. And also, they sometimes just feel like a completely different text. You can't get always the same emotion or idea from them in one language to the other. I think the most exciting thing for me was when I was translating them into English for class from Old North Icelandic, because I actually tend to translate it in English, but also in Spanish as I'm doing that. And so I feel like I'm holding the same story, but 3 different stories as well at the same time in my head as I'm doing this. And so I feel like I have then access to 3 different versions and 3 different readings of the same text at the same time.
That's wonderful.
So it's fun for me. I think I often had a different reading than my colleagues, just because I came at it from these ways. And it just also allowed me to always think of multiples. I just don't think that there's just one story. There's always multiple stories to me being told at the same time because of that. And I think that's a good thing. So I'm glad that I experience these languages in that way.
So I think that is a lovely place to end. Thank you so much for joining us and talking about these lovely sagas.
Yeah, thank you, Nahir.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Well, listeners, if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at spouter@megaphonic.fm, or we're on Twitter @thespouter. We'd love to hear from you. Show notes with links for things that we've mentioned in this episode will be at megaphonic.fm/spouter/42b, and the Spouter-Inn is one of the fancy little podcasts over at Megaphonic FM. So until next time.
Until next time, see you again at the Spouter-Inn.